Thank you so much. So, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to finally be able to share a fragment of my thesis work from the last month. It went about the identification of priority habitats in the upper São Vicente Submarine Canyon, which is located in Portugal, as Tim already said. So, to start with, submarine canyons are incisions in the continental margin. They're characterized by strong currents and a heterogeneous seascape. The environmental conditions of submarine canyons may favor the establishment and the occurrence of a wide range of marine fauna, and particularly of filter-feeding organisms such as sponges and corals, which are also referred to as engineering species, because of the structure they confer to their environment, which may provide shelter, feeding opportunities, and reproductive grounds for other species. All these facts feed into the theory that submarine canyons may host a higher biodiversity and biomass than the surrounding shelf and slope. So the complex geomorphology of submarine canyons has often limited fishing practices such as bottom trawling to areas outside of the canyon, where the substrates are flatter and softer often. Such practices, as you will already know, are highly damaging for engineering species which live attached to the bottom, which is why submarine canyons have been referred to as refuges and even larval sources for those species which may otherwise be swept away from the more impacted surrounding shelf and slope. Nevertheless, bottom trawling practices have been proved to have far-reaching effects in terms of sediment resuspension, which may disturb the sediment regime of entire canyon systems, and particularly at the head of the canyons. Such effects may be particularly damaging for filter-feeding organisms. So the problem is that we know that these areas may host a richer biodiversity and biomass in the surrounding areas. We know that current threats are present, and we can only expect these threats to rise in the future as our resource demand increases. So despite all these facts, submarine canyons remain mostly unmapped and undescribed. So to promote a evidence-based management, the identification of vulnerable marine habitats is absolutely fundamental. Several frameworks and classification systems have been developed to facilitate the identification of habitats that require priority in protection. Particularly, the OSPAR Convention has worked to assess the status and threats of vulnerable marine habitats in the OSPAR region. This work has resulted in the OSPAR list of threatened or declining species and habitats, also referred to as the list of priority habitats. These come with definitions and recommendations. So besides of that, the OSPAR Convention states that the contracting parties are obliged to take the necessary measures to protect and conserve the ecosystems and biological diversity of the maritime area, which only reinforces the importance of findings on this list. The Habitats Directive furthermore comes with a list of species that require different levels of priority in protection. The FAO has furthermore developed guidelines for the identification of vulnerable marine ecosystems, and the UNIS habitat classification is currently actually of no use for submarine canyons, as it remains undeveloped for these features. So the aims of this study, the first one was to identify priority habitats and potential priority habitats from a remotely operated vehicle survey in the upper São Vicente Submarine Canyon from footage from 2011. This was pursued through multivariate analysis, visual assessments, pre- and post-analysis, and through criteria derived from current definitions of priority habitats. Now, to support future mapping efforts and the incorporation of canyon habitats into classification systems, the second aim was to give complete characterizations of the habitats, which was done through descriptions and exploratory data analysis. And lastly, because ROV surveys are not very efficient to map huge areas, more effective means such as predictive habitat models have been developed. Nevertheless, these rely on solid knowledge on the environmental drivers for the species that you intend to map. So the third aim of the study was to explore the relative importance of environmental drivers for the distribution of priority habitats in this canyon, as such knowledge is currently very scarce for submarine canyons. This was pursued through multivariate multiple regression and ordination methods, as will be explained. The São Vicente Submarine Canyon is located in the southwest of Portugal. It is one of the largest features of the region. It stretches for about 120 kilometers in length and 20 kilometers in width. The data from the study was obtained from the head of the canyon, as can be seen on these maps. 3 ROV exploratory surveys were conducted at the head of the canyon between 90 and 560 meters. 8,800 meters were approximately covered with the 2 cameras that were attached to the ROV. Now, to identify the priority habitats from this data, I started with a thorough video analysis. Species annotations were done to the lowest possible taxonomic level with the help of other researchers, and the environmental variables were annotated continuously. The transects were subsequently subdivided into 10-meter samples. Only those samples that had a uniform substrate type within them and that had at least 1 megabenthic species annotation were considered for further analysis. These samples were subjected to a clustering analysis, and the resulting clusters from this analysis were validated through SimProf. SimProf was used to obtain the characteristic species of each cluster. These clusters were then subjected to a set of self-developed criteria, which I derived from definitions from the aforementioned frameworks, and particularly the OSPAR definitions. The first criteria was that the cluster had to be characterized by at least 1 engineering, vulnerable, and/or protected species. Furthermore, the cluster had to occur at relevant densities, the species, and at a minimum extension of 35 square meters, which was a very conservative measure. Lastly, the cluster had to be visually distinguishable to be considered a separate habitat. So to clarify on this last criteria, no clusters were excluded. Instead, they were pooled into broader habitat types, as can be seen on this resulting dendrogram, where each color represents a particular habitat type. This was done to retain the intraspecific habitat variability, which would have been lost through a more classic method, like a 20% cutoff, for example. So these habitats were then tested against each other through a permutational multivariate analysis to ensure that these habitats were still distinct from each other after this pooling criteria. The characteristic species were again obtained through SimProf. So the characteristic species, substrate type, relief, depth, and biodiversity was derived for each habitat, and the latter, the biodiversity, was tested between the habitats to check if any had any higher biodiversity than others. The habitats were then evaluated against existing definitions to determine whether they were of priority or not. Now, to obtain a quantitative measure of the environmental variables, they were inserted or incorporated into a distance-based linear model, which was again visualized through a distance-based redundancy analysis, resulting in a plot similar to this one, although the plot was superimposed by each environmental variable. So the substrate type was treated as a categorical variable, and the depth and relief were treated as continuous variables. This methodology resulted in or revealed 10 distinct priority habitats. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to elaborate on each habitat as much as I wish I could, but please write down any questions you may have as I go forward now, and you may ask at the end of the session. So 6 distinct habitats were qualified as OSPAR coral gardens, 1 habitat qualified as a deep-sea sponge aggregation, 2 circalittoral sponge aggregations qualified as reefs under the Habitats Directive. Now, the reason why circalittoral sponge aggregations are not included in the list of priority habitats under OSPAR has been addressed, and it's been said that it's literally because of a lack of knowledge rather than because of a lack of vulnerability or threats, which is obviously not the case. Now, just briefly, the first coral garden was characterized by a mix of anthozoan species, including the protected Corallium rubrum. The second one was a dense black coral forest characterized by Antipatella supinata. The 3 following ones were Gorgonian gardens of different species and size variations, one of which was also a combination habitat with sponges. And the last coral garden was characterized by solitary scleractinians and occurred in the deep sea, while the other ones were circalittoral. The deep sea sponge aggregation was characterized by the peculiar Asconema setuvalense, which clearly formed structures and provided habitat for other species. The first circalittoral sponge aggregation was dominated by small yellow erect stipitate or lollipop sponges, as they're also called, and laminar sponges. It extended for several hundred square meters over the surveyed area. And the second circalittoral sponge aggregation seemed to be dominated by a species identified as Artemisina transiens, which could possibly be the second recorded habitat ever of this species, and the first one in a canyon. The last priority habitat was characterized by a strictly protected species of sea urchin, namely the Centrostephanus longispinus. This study may also have expanded its depth range with about 100 meters. And as the Habitat Directive states, a strict protection regime must be applied across their entire natural range within the EU, which is why this was included as a priority habitat, although it is not an engineering species. Other habitats of potential conservation value were also identified, although their densities were too low to qualify for the aforementioned categories, besides of the last one, which was a crinoid aggregation, which could be an indicator of highly productive areas. The habitat distribution maps show the high extension and diversity of priority habitats, which covered about 50% of the entire sampled area, which could indicate that a substantial distribution of these habitats may occur in the canyon overall. So for the environmental drivers, it appears that all of the variables were significant. Species seem to show a greater dependence on substrate type than on depth, which could possibly be explained by the complex geomorphology and hydrodynamics which occur in submarine canyons, which could possibly cause a patchiness in food availability, again causing a disruption of common depth distribution patterns. So the key takeaways for management from this study is that the diversity of priority habitats in the canyon appeared to be remarkable compared to other canyons in the Mediterranean and Northeast Atlantic. It may contain unique aggregations, and the overlapping depths with fishing efforts in the near surrounding area is worrying, together with the muddy flanks of the canyon, which may attract bottom trawling fisheries. The location of the canyon is noteworthy because it's located in one of the most impacted areas of Europe, and the southwest of Portugal is one of the main target areas for crustacean trawling fisheries. The ecological and societal relevance of the habitats furthermore, is noteworthy because there's extensive evidence on the biomass and biodiversity enhancement by coral gardens and sponge aggregations. There's economical value in the fishery support provided by these habitats through the support of secondary production. And furthermore, the biological traits of these habitats should be taken into account, and a precautionary approach is completely necessary. The extremely fragile and slow growth and low recovery potential after damage of these species, characterizing the habitats that I identified. So the conclusions of the study are the following. The wide range and spread of priority habitats and vulnerable marine ecosystem indicator species of Mediterranean and Northeast Atlantic origin. The establishment of a marine protected area restricting bottom fisheries should definitely be discussed, as together with the effect of sediment resuspension, which should definitely be considered in the design. Habitats, the habitats need to be incorporated into regional databases and classification systems to aid in large-scale conservation efforts. And some support has been gained for future predictive mapping efforts, both locally and globally, for submarine canyons. Now, I got a bit stressed because that was a bit over time, but thank you for listening, and I really hope you do have some questions so I can elaborate further. Thank you so much.